Let's welcome to the lectern Edward Conard. He is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and former founding member and managing director of Bain Capital. Ladies and gentlemen, Ed Conard.
Don't let our opponents hijack this debate. This is not a debate about whether the Fed should act as a lender of last resort in a run on the banks. We all agree with that point that they have made, and that's why they've taken this position, because you can't disagree with it. This is a debate about radical monetary policy that tries to print money in order to stimulate growth after a bank run in a recession. This is not QE1, this is QE infinity. It's easiest to understand monetary policy by considering a simple corn economy. We can plant the corn, that's investment. We can eat it, that's consumption, or we can store the corn in a silo and exchange it for a piece of paper that says, I owe you a bushel of corn. That's money. Recessions occur when people get scared and start storing corn instead of eating it or planting it. Growth slows and unemployment rises. It's important to recognize the Fed doesn't grow corn, nor can it teleport corn back from the future and spend it today. All it can do is print IOUs. By printing more IOUs, monetary policy tries to change your behavior today. It motivates you to stop saving and start spending again. It does this by threatening the value of your savings with price inflation in the future. With more IOUs outstanding, you should logically run to the bank, to the silo, withdraw your corn, and use it before the economy recovers. People start exchanging IOUs for corn, and the silos run low on corn when prices rise and the dollar is worth less. But here's the rub. The Fed increased the monetary base from $800 billion to $4 trillion, an unprecedented five-fold increase in the monetary base, and it had no effect on anyone's fear of inflation whatsoever. No one ran to the banks to spend their savings. The money sat unused, neither lent nor borrowed, creating neither growth nor inflation. Why? Because the Fed has promised to prevent inflation by contracting the money supply before the economy recovers and people start exchanging IOUs for corn. With hard-fought decades of successfully defeating price inflation, the Fed has earned its credibility. And with the Republicans threatening the Fed's independence if it doesn't fight inflation, the Fed's promise has even more credibility. Advocates of quantitative easing pretend that we can have our cake and eat it too, that we can scare savers into spending by printing money without needing to inflict the cost of inflation on the economy after it recovers. But it didn't work when we needed the stimulus. Even Ben Bernanke now admits quantitative easing will only work if it's permanent, if it's guaranteed to inflict inflation on the economy. But nowhere does he advocate making quantitative easing permanent because of the damage it inflicts. And the Fed increased the monetary base while the government was pumping $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus into the economy, increasing debt from 30% of GDP to 70%. That's 6 times more than the $1 trillion stimulus Krugman initially complained was too small. And even with aggressive fiscal stimulus, which advocates of stimulus contend is far more powerful than monetary stimulus, we saw no bounce back in growth whatsoever. Instead, we've seen tepid growth off a permanently lower base for 6 years and counting. It's true the Fed has recovered faster than Europe, but the U.S. has been growing faster than Europe for decades because of Silicon Valley and entrepreneurial risk-taking. And for 3 decades and counting, Japan has tried the same thing, large fiscal deficits and near-zero interest rates with nothing but slow growth to show for it. Now advocates of monetary policy insist if the Fed recklessly throws the steering wheel out the window and balloons the monetary base to $9 trillion, that will scare everyone into spending. Perhaps it will, but the truth has been revealed. It takes a massive amount of monetary inflation to produce a minuscule increase in demand. Enormous risk for little, if any, benefit. No mainstream economist takes these reckless proposals seriously. Our opponents will ignore these risks and claim only that lower interest rates and wealth effects stimulate investment, despite Ben Bernanke's admission that, quote, quantitative easing works in practice, just not in theory. But the economists in the audience know that after decades of research, there's no consensus whether interest rates, especially short-term overnight borrowing rates, affect real long-term investment. Why? Because unused corn lowers interest rates and makes investment cheaper, not more paper IOUs. Rogers speculates in his op-eds that quantitative easing may account for about an additional 1/3 of a percentage point reduction in the interest rate. Who believes a reduction in interest rates, especially a measly 1/3 of a percentage point, determines how fast Apple develops the next generation iPhone? Like all companies, Apple can't afford not to innovate and invest as fast as it can, no matter the interest rate. Real increases in wealth might stimulate investment, but nobody's fooled by equity prices inflated by low interest rates and an increased risk of inflation. If the Fed does nothing more than print IOUs, who here believes that increases wealth? Phony IOUs increase risk, risk reduces wealth. The economy may not be perfectly rational, but business leaders who create prosperity aren't stupid either. They surely don't increase investment and risk-taking in the face of increased government spending and the risk of inflation. They dial back. There is simply no compelling evidence that fiscal and monetary stimulus increases real business investment. If anything, the evidence shows the opposite, a dial back in business investment in the face of risky stimulus. And no surprise, in the wake of $3 trillion of monetary stimulus and $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus, lackluster business investment and unusually slow productivity growth have been the chief reasons for the slow recovery. Financial speculators, many who borrow short to buy long-term financial assets, may be sensitive to short-term rates, doubly so given the amplifying effects of herd mentality, but financial arbitrage is a zero-sum game that does nothing to grow the economy. Quantitative easing doesn't work in theory. That's why it doesn't work in practice either. After $4 trillion of quantitative easing, Ben Bernanke has reconsidered his view. Last month in the Wall Street Journal, he admitted, quote, the Fed cannot print its way to prosperity because the Fed has no control over long-term economic fundamentals. Don't let these guys fool you. There's no free lunch. Don't give reckless monetary policy a mandate. Only hard work, investment, innovation, successful risk-taking create prosperity. Side with Ben Bernanke and vote against the motion, central banks can print their way to prosperity. Don't let these guys hijack the debate and make it a debate about whether the Fed should have bailed out the banking system. I was on TV last week telling everybody that the Fed needed to bail out the banking system. There isn't a serious economist on the planet who disagrees with that. And the reason why they've taken the debate there instead of to QE infinity, what has occurred for the 6 years after the bailout in the crisis, is because it didn't work and they know it. Vote against quantitative easing will create prosperity. It has created no prosperity.
Thank you, Ed Conard. Here summarizing his position against the motion, Edward Conard, visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
Liberal Berkeley economist Brad DeLong recently described each side of the motion we're debating. About our opponent's view, he said, quote, even though the Fed printed much more money than economists would have thought necessary to offset the impact of the financial crisis, a five-fold increase in the monetary base from $800 billion to $4 trillion, it wasn't enough. Bernanke balked at taking the next step, more than doubling the monetary base to $9 trillion, end quote. Roger has publicly described a far more modest UK proposal as dangerous and delusional, arguing that, quote, sometimes a sovereign has no alternative to inflationary finance, but this always has significant costs, and it's never the place to start or end. Our view of monetary policy, Berkeley's DeLong said, quote, Larry Summers and Paul Krugman argue that there is little evidence that monetary policy will ever restore full prosperity, end quote. DeLong admits he doesn't know which one of these views is correct. Why doesn't DeLong know which one of these views is correct? Because $3 trillion of printing has produced no discernible effect on the economy. And if it had, DeLong would have seen it, and he would be urging more. Our opponents can't bring any more evidence to the debate that central banks can print their way to prosperity than what Summers, Krugman, and DeLong have already considered. If the evidence hasn't persuaded even those ardent advocates of stimulus, why should it persuade you? Bernanke now flat out admits central banks cannot print their way to prosperity. Our opponents have the burden of proving the motion true, a very tough burden in this case. They haven't made a convincing argument because no one can make a convincing argument on this issue. I urge you to vote against the far-fetched motion central banks can print their way to prosperity.